I'm Jessica Taylor, 24 years old, and 8 months ago, I thought I'd hit rock bottom when my boyfriend Tyler broke up with me after 2.5 years together. I was wrong. Rock bottom was last Tuesday when my little sister Maddie called me sobbing, saying she had news that would change everything. She was pregnant with Tyler's baby, and she wanted me to be her maid of honor at their wedding. My hands shook as I held the phone, my coffee growing cold on my kitchen counter. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd ever felt, but what came next? That's when things got really twisted. The fallout from my decision tore our family apart in ways I never imagined possible. If you've ever been betrayed by the people you trusted most, share your story in the comments below. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Looking back now, I should have seen the signs that my perfect little life in Portland was about to implode. Every morning started the same way in my downtown loft apartment. My alarm would buzz at 6:30, and I'd stumble to my tiny kitchen to make coffee before heading to Bright Ideas Marketing, where I worked as a junior coordinator. The Pearl District was bustling with the usual crowd of professionals rushing to their offices, everyone clutching their morning caffeine fix like a lifeline. I loved my routine, loved the predictability of it all. Work was demanding but rewarding, creating campaigns for local businesses and watching my ideas come to life. My boss Jennifer had been hinting at a promotion, and I was putting in extra hours to prove myself worthy of the senior coordinator position that had recently opened up. The commute gave me time to think, usually about my goals and dreams. I had a 5-year plan mapped out in a notebook I kept in my purse. Get promoted within 6 months. Save enough for a down payment on a condo. Maybe start my own marketing consultancy by the time I turned 30. Tyler's face used to flash through my mind during these morning drives, but 8 months after our breakup, the sting had finally started to fade. We'd dated for 2.5 years, and I thought we'd end up married. He was a construction supervisor, steady and reliable, with calloused hands and an easy smile that made me feel safe. Our breakup had been brutal, not because of fighting or cheating, but because he said he wasn't ready for the commitment I wanted. He needed space to figure out his life, he claimed. I spent months analyzing every conversation we'd had, wondering if I'd pushed too hard or expected too much. My sister Maddie had been my rock during those dark post-breakup months. She was 22, 2 years younger than me, and still living in our family home in Beaverton, with our parents Robert and Linda. Maddie worked part-time at a trendy boutique in southeast Portland, spending most of her paycheck on clothes and weekend adventures. She had this effortless beauty that I'd always envied, blonde hair that fell in perfect waves while mine required an hour of styling to look decent. Where I was serious and goal-oriented, Maddie was spontaneous and fun-loving. She could walk into any room and immediately become the center of attention, drawing people to her magnetic personality like moths to a flame. During my breakup recovery, Maddie would show up at my apartment unannounced with ice cream and terrible romantic comedies. She'd listen to me cry about Tyler, offering tissues and fierce declarations that he didn't deserve me anyway. We'd grown closer than we'd ever been, bonding over late-night conversations about life, love, and our dreams for the future. She was the one person I trusted completely, the one who knew all my secrets and fears. Our parents had divorced when I was 12, and she was 10, then both remarried within a few years. The chaos of blended families and custody arrangements had made us each other's constant companions and closest confidants. Maddie had been single for most of the time Tyler and I dated, claiming she was too young to settle down. She went on casual dates but never anything serious, always saying she was waiting for the right person to sweep her off her feet. I admired her confidence and independence, even as I sometimes worried she was being too picky. She had expensive tastes and champagne dreams on a part-time retail budget, but somehow always managed to look like she'd stepped off a magazine cover. Work became my escape, and my obsession after the breakup. I threw myself into campaigns with an intensity that impressed my colleagues and occasionally worried my best friend Becca. She worked as a graphic designer at a different agency across town, and we'd meet for coffee at Bean there, our favorite local spot, every Friday after work. Becca was the voice of reason in my life, always ready with practical advice and honest feedback. She had dark curly hair and an infectious laugh that could lift my mood even on the worst days. When I started working 60-hour weeks, she was the one who reminded me that healing didn't mean becoming a workaholic. The Portland weather had been particularly moody that spring, shifting between sunny skies and sudden downpours that reflected my own emotional state. I'd started jogging along the Willamette River on weekends, finding peace in the rhythm of my feet against the pavement and the sight of the water flowing steadily toward the ocean. The city felt full of possibilities, with its food trucks and coffee roasters, its bridges and bookstores. I was finally starting to feel like myself again, like I could build a life here that was entirely my own. My relationship with Tyler had been comfortable, maybe too comfortable. We fell into routines quickly, spending most weekends at his apartment watching movies or hanging out with his construction crew buddies. He was 6 feet tall, with sandy brown hair and green eyes that crinkled when he laughed. His hands were always slightly rough from his work, but gentle when he touched me. We talked about getting married someday, about buying a house with a big backyard where we could have barbecues and maybe raise kids. But whenever I brought up concrete timelines or specific plans, he'd get this distant look in his eyes and change the subject. The breakup happened on a rainy Tuesday evening in September. I'd made his favorite dinner, pot roast with mashed potatoes, and was planning to bring up the idea of moving in together. Instead, he sat across from me at my small dining table and said he couldn't do it anymore. He felt trapped, suffocated by my expectations and plans. He needed to figure out who he was outside of our relationship, he explained, his voice gentle but firm. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. All my carefully laid plans, all my assumptions about our future together, crumbled in the span of one conversation. The months that followed were a blur of tears, ice cream and late-night phone calls with Becca and Maddie. I threw myself into work with desperate intensity, staying late every night and volunteering for extra projects. My boss Jennifer noticed my increased dedication and started giving me more responsibility, which felt like the only bright spot in my otherwise dark world. I deleted Tyler's number from my phone, unfriended him on social media, and avoided all the places we used to go together. Portland suddenly felt smaller, like I might run into him around any corner. Maddie was my constant companion during this time, showing up with surprising maturity and emotional support. She'd arrive at my apartment with takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant and listen while I processed my feelings. She never pushed me to get over it faster or offered empty platitudes about there being other fish in the sea. Instead, she sat with me in my pain and helped me slowly piece myself back together. I was grateful for her presence, even as part of me worried I was becoming too dependent on my younger sister's emotional labor. The winter months were particularly hard, with Portland's gray skies matching my mood perfectly. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Sarah Martinez, who helped me work through my tendency to define myself through relationships. She challenged me to think about what I wanted for my own life, independent of any romantic partner. Slowly, I began to rediscover interests and passions that had gotten lost in the comfortable routine of my.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
My relationship with Tyler. I started taking weekend photography classes, exploring neighborhoods I'd never visited, and setting goals that were entirely my own. By spring, I was starting to feel human again. The promotion at work was within reach, and I'd been saving money consistently for the first time in months. My apartment felt like home instead of a sad consolation prize. I was even considering joining a hiking group that Becca had recommended, thinking it might be time to expand my social circle beyond work and my sister. The future was starting to look bright again, full of possibilities I could create entirely on my own terms. I felt proud of how far I'd come, how I'd rebuilt my confidence and sense of self after such a devastating blow to my heart and ego. That's when everything changed with one phone call that would shatter my newly rebuilt world into pieces even smaller than before. The phone rang at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, jolting me from the marketing presentation I was reviewing on my laptop. I almost ignored it, assuming it was a spam call or wrong number, but Maddie's name flashed on the screen. My heart immediately started racing because she never called this late, unless something was seriously wrong. Her voice was thick with tears when I answered, and I could barely make out her words through the sobbing. She was at our parents' house, she managed to say between gasps, and she needed to see me right away. Something had happened, something big, and she couldn't tell me over the phone. I threw on jeans and a sweatshirt, grabbed my keys and drove the 20 minutes to Beaverton in record time. The suburban streets were quiet and dark, with only the occasional porch light breaking up the shadows. Our childhood home looked exactly the same as it had for the past decade, a modest 2-story house with blue shutters, and a small front garden that our mom Linda obsessively maintained. The living room lights were on, which meant our parents were probably still awake, likely worried about whatever crisis had reduced their youngest daughter to hysterics. Maddie was curled up on the familiar brown sectional sofa when I walked in, still crying into a handful of tissues. Mom was sitting beside her, rubbing her back and making soothing sounds, while Dad paced near the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and a grim expression on his weathered face. The scene reminded me of countless other family emergencies over the years, from failed tests to broken hearts to minor car accidents. But something about the heaviness in the room told me this was different, more serious than anything we'd faced before. She looked up when I entered, her blue eyes red and puffy, her usually perfect blonde hair matted against her cheek. For a moment neither of us spoke, and I could feel my parents' tension radiating through the room like heat from a furnace. Finally she took a shaky breath and said the words that would change everything between us forever. She was pregnant, she whispered, and the father was Tyler. My ex-boyfriend of 8 months, the man I'd loved and planned a future with, the one who'd shattered my heart, claiming he wasn't ready for commitment with me. The room seemed to spin around me as I processed what she'd just said. I sank into Dad's recliner, my legs suddenly unable to support my weight. The familiar surroundings of our family home felt surreal, like I was watching this scene happen to someone else. How long, I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. How long had this been going on? Maddie's fresh tears were my answer before she even spoke. 3 months, she said. Maybe 4. It started not long after Christmas, when she'd run into Tyler at a party thrown by our mutual friend David Martinez. The timeline hit me like a physical blow. Christmas had been only 4 months after our breakup, when I was still raw and broken, still crying myself to sleep most nights. While I was struggling to rebuild my life, grieving the loss of our relationship, Tyler had been moving on with my own sister. The sister who'd held me while I cried about him, who'd listened to me dissect every moment of our relationship, who'd assured me repeatedly that he was an idiot for letting me go. Mom kept shooting worried glances between Maddie and me, clearly unsure how to navigate this unprecedented family crisis. Dad's pacing had intensified, and I could hear him muttering under his breath about responsibility and consequences. The whole scene felt like something out of a soap opera, too dramatic and painful to be my actual life. I kept waiting to wake up from what had to be the worst nightmare I'd ever experienced. Maddie continued talking through her tears, explaining how it had happened. She'd been feeling lonely after her latest dating disappointment, and Tyler had been at the party looking lost and drinking too much. They'd started talking, commiserating about relationships and life changes, and one thing had led to another. It was supposed to be a one-time mistake, she insisted, something that happened in a moment of weakness and alcohol-fueled poor judgment. But then they'd kept running into each other around Portland's surprisingly small social circles, and the conversations had continued. She swore it wasn't planned, wasn't some deliberate betrayal of our sisterly bond. Tyler had been struggling too, she said, missing me but too proud to admit he'd made a mistake in breaking up with me. Their connection had grown slowly, built on shared guilt and mutual understanding of the pain they'd both caused me. By February, they were seeing each other regularly, though they'd kept it secret from everyone, including our parents and all our friends. The secret relationship revelation hurt almost as much as the pregnancy announcement. For months, while I'd been slowly healing and rebuilding my confidence, they'd been creating a life together behind my back. Every family dinner where Maddie had seemed distracted, every time she'd canceled plans at the last minute, every conversation where she'd seemed to be hiding something, it all made sense now. The elaborate web of lies and deception they'd constructed to keep their relationship hidden felt like a betrayal that went beyond simple romantic complications. I thought about all the times over the past few months when Maddie had asked seemingly innocent questions about Tyler. How was I feeling about the breakup? Did I ever think about getting back together with him? Had I heard anything about what he was doing or who he was dating? I'd interpreted these as sisterly concern for my emotional well-being, but now I realized she'd been gathering intelligence, making sure I wasn't harboring hopes for reconciliation while she was building a future with him. The pregnancy, she continued, had been a complete shock to both of them. They'd been careful, she insisted, but apparently not careful enough. When she'd missed her period and taken the test, she'd called Tyler immediately, and they'd both sat in his truck in the parking lot of a pharmacy, staring at the positive result in stunned silence. They'd spent weeks trying to figure out what to do, whether to keep the baby, whether to tell anyone about their relationship, whether they could possibly make it work as a real couple. Tyler had stepped up, she said with obvious admiration in her voice. He'd immediately started talking about responsibility and doing the right thing, about providing for the baby and creating a stable home. The man who'd told me he wasn't ready for commitment had apparently found his sense of responsibility when faced with impending fatherhood and a different woman. The irony wasn't lost on me, and it stung worse than I could have imagined possible. They'd decided to get married, she announced, the words hitting me like physical blows. Tyler had proposed just last week, with a simple diamond ring that he'd saved for months to buy. Nothing elaborate or romantic, just a quiet moment in his apartment where they'd acknowledged the reality of their situation and decided to make it official. The wedding would be small, she said, just family and a few close friends, sometime in early fall before the baby was due. Then came the request that finished destroying what was left of my heart. She wanted me to be her maid of honor, she said, looking at me with desperate hope in her tear-stained eyes. I was the most important person in her life, her best friend and closest confidant, and she couldn't imagine getting married without me by her side. She knew it was complicated, she acknowledged, knew it might be difficult for me, but she was hoping our sisterly bond was strong enough to overcome any awkwardness about Tyler. The word awkwardness felt like the understatement of the century. This wasn't about awkwardness or minor discomfort. This was about standing beside my sister as she married the man I'd loved, the man I'd imagined building a life with, the man who'd rejected my dreams of commitment only to embrace them enthusiastically with someone else. It was about celebrating their happiness while pretending my heart wasn't breaking all over again, about putting on a fake smile and playing the role of supportive sister while watching my ex-boyfriend promise to love and honor my replacement. Our parents were clearly struggling with how to respond to this whole situation. Mom kept wringing her hands and shooting anxious looks between us, while Dad's pacing had taken on an angry edge. They'd always liked Tyler during our relationship, welcoming him to family dinners and holiday celebrations, but this development had blindsided them as much as it had me. The complications of having Tyler permanently embedded in our family dynamic, of future holidays and birthdays and family gatherings, were obviously weighing on their minds. I sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to process the magnitude of what Maddie had just dumped in my lap. My little sister was pregnant by my ex-boyfriend. They were getting married. She wanted me to be her maid of honor. The three facts swirled around in my head like a tornado, each one individually devastating but collectively overwhelming. Finally, I found my voice, though it sounded hollow and strange to my own ears. I told her I needed time to think, that this was too much to process all at once. She nodded eagerly, clearly hoping my request for time meant I was considering saying yes to her maid of honor request. Mom suggested we all get some sleep and revisit the conversation when emotions weren't running so high. Dad just shook his head and disappeared into the kitchen, probably to pour himself a very large drink. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of streetlights and tears. I kept having to pull over when my vision became too clouded to see the road safely. The familiar route through Portland's quiet neighborhoods felt like a journey through an alien landscape. Everything changed by the revelation that had turned my world upside down. By the time I finally made it home and collapsed on my couch, it was nearly 3 in the morning, and I felt like I'd aged a decade in just a few hours. I called in sick to work the next day, something I'd never done except when actually physically ill. Jennifer, my boss, was understanding when I told her I was dealing with a family emergency, but I could hear the concern in her voice. I'd been so reliable, so consistent in my work performance, that this unexpected absence clearly worried her. I promised to be back the following day, though I had no idea how I was going to focus on marketing campaigns and client presentations when my personal life had just exploded. Becca called around noon, having heard through some mutual connection that there was drama in the Taylor family. I found myself telling her everything, the words spilling out in a chaotic rush of pain and betrayal and disbelief. She listened in stunned silence, occasionally making small sounds of sympathy or shock. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before saying she was coming over immediately with wine and chocolate and whatever else I might need to get through this crisis. The rest of that day passed in a haze of tears, wine and increasingly angry conversations with Becca about the betrayal and selfishness of both Tyler and Maddie. She pointed out things I hadn't even considered yet, like how this would affect every future family gathering, every holiday, every milestone celebration. Tyler would be permanently woven into our family fabric now, and I'd have to watch him and Maddie build the life together that I'd once imagined for myself. But the maid of honor request was what really kept me awake that night, staring at the ceiling of my bedroom and trying to imagine how such a scenario could possibly work. How could I stand beside my sister wearing a dress she'd chosen, holding her bouquet while she promised to love and honor the man who'd broken my heart? How could I smile for photos and give a speech about their happiness and their bright future together? How could I celebrate their love story which had begun while I was still picking up the pieces of my own broken dreams? The more I thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. But then I'd remember Maddie's tear-stained face, her desperate hope that our sisterly bond could overcome this complication. I'd think about our parents, already stressed about the situation, and how much worse it would be if I refused to participate in the wedding. I'd consider the baby, innocent in all of this, who would be my niece or nephew regardless of how I felt about their parents. By morning, I was no closer to an answer, but I knew one thing for certain. This situation was going to test every relationship in my life, starting with the one that mattered most to me. The question was whether my love for Maddie was strong enough to survive the ultimate betrayal, or whether some lines once crossed could never be uncrossed. The next few days felt like I was moving through thick fog, going through the motions of living while my mind remained stuck on that terrible Tuesday night revelation. I showed up to work at Bright Ideas Marketing and somehow managed to complete my tasks, though I had to read emails 3 times before comprehending their content. My colleagues noticed something was off, but I brushed away their concerned questions with vague mentions of family stress and personal issues. Jennifer called me into her office on Thursday afternoon, her expression a mix of professional concern and genuine worry. She'd noticed my distraction, she said carefully, and wanted to make sure everything was all right. The senior coordinator position was still available, and I was her top candidate, but the promotion would come with increased responsibilities and client-facing work that required complete mental presence. Could I handle that right now? She asked gently, or did I need some time to sort out whatever was happening in my personal life? I assured her I was fine, that I'd have everything under control soon, but even as the words left my mouth, I wondered if they were true. The truth was that Maddie's request had taken up permanent residence in my brain, playing on an endless loop every waking moment. At my desk, I'd find myself staring at my computer screen without seeing anything, imagining different versions of the wedding day. In some scenarios, I stood beside Maddie wearing a forced smile while my heart shattered. In others, I refused her request and watched from the back of the venue, alone and obviously bitter. In the worst versions, I didn't attend at all, creating a family rift that would never fully heal. Maddie had been calling and texting constantly, each message a variation on the same theme. She understood I needed space, she'd say, but she hoped I knew how much it would mean to her if I agreed to be her maid of honor. She'd attached photos of bridesmaid dresses she was considering, soft lavender or pale blue options that she thought would look beautiful. The casual way she discussed wedding details, as if this were any normal marriage and not the union of my ex-boyfriend and my sister, made my stomach turn every time. My photography class, which had been such a joyful creative outlet over the past few months, suddenly felt like another obligation I could barely manage. On Saturday morning, I dragged myself to the session in a community center near the Willamette River. We were supposed to be practicing portrait composition, partnering up to photograph each other in natural light, but I kept losing focus, my shots coming out blurry or poorly framed, my mind wandering to Tyler and Maddie instead of staying present with my camera. The instructor, a kind woman named Patricia who'd been encouraging my growing skills, pulled me aside during a break. My work had been so promising in recent weeks, she said, but today's session showed a marked decline in attention and technique. Was everything okay? She wanted to know. I mumbled something about personal distractions and promised to do better next week. But walking to my car afterward, I wondered if I'd even come back. What was the point of pursuing hobbies and creative passions when my entire emotional foundation had been demolished? Becca insisted on meeting me for lunch that Saturday afternoon at a small cafe near Powell's Books. She'd been checking in daily since the revelation, and I could tell she was getting increasingly worried about my state of mind. Over sandwiches and coffee that I barely touched, she studied my face with obvious concern. I looked exhausted, she said bluntly, like I hadn't slept in days, which was accurate. Had I made a decision about the maid of honor situation, she asked, and more importantly, had I actually spoken to Tyler since finding out about the pregnancy? The Tyler question stopped me cold because I realized I'd been actively avoiding thinking about him as an individual person in this scenario. He'd become abstract in my mind, just part of the terrible situation rather than someone I'd once loved deeply. But Becca was right to bring him up because his silence throughout this whole ordeal was its own form of betrayal. He hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't attempted to explain or apologize or even acknowledge the massive bomb he dropped into my life by getting my sister pregnant. That realization sparked something in me that felt like anger cutting through the fog of shock and hurt. Tyler owed me a conversation, at minimum, an explanation for how this had happened and why he'd hidden it for months. Maddie might be my sister, but he'd been my partner, the person I'd trusted with my heart and my future plans. The fact that he was letting Maddie deliver all the news and make all the requests while he stayed conveniently absent felt like cowardice of the highest order. Becca encouraged this flash of anger, suggesting that maybe confronting Tyler would help me process the situation and figure out what I actually wanted to do. She offered to come with me for moral support, but I knew this was something I needed to handle alone. After lunch, I sat in my car in the parking garage and stared at my phone for a full 10 minutes before finally pulling up Tyler's contact information. I'd deleted his number months ago, but I'd memorized it during our years together, and my fingers remembered the pattern even as my mind tried to forget. He answered on the third ring, his voice cautious when he said my name like a question. There was background noise on his end, the sounds of a construction site with machinery and male voices shouting instructions. For a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching out awkwardly until I finally asked if we could meet to talk. He hesitated, and I could practically hear him weighing his options before agreeing to meet me at Riverside Park in an hour. The park had been one of our regular spots during our relationship, and choosing it felt either masochistic or appropriate. I couldn't decide which. I arrived early and claimed a bench overlooking the water, watching joggers and cyclists pass by on the path. The spring weather was perfect, sunny and mild with just enough breeze to keep things comfortable, the kind of day that normally would have lifted my spirits. Instead, I felt numb, disconnected from the beauty around me as I rehearsed what I wanted to say. When Tyler finally appeared, walking across the grass toward me, I was struck by how familiar and foreign he looked at the same time. He'd gotten a haircut since I'd last seen him, shorter than he usually wore it, and there were new lines around his eyes that might have been from stress or sun exposure. His construction company polo shirt was faded and worn, his jeans stained with what looked like concrete dust. He sat down on the bench beside me but kept a careful distance, his body language screaming discomfort. For a long moment we both just stared at the river, watching the water flow steadily downstream while we tried to figure out how to start this impossible conversation. Finally he spoke first, his voice rough and uncertain. He was sorry, he said, though the words sounded inadequate even to him based on the way he winced after saying them. He never meant for this to happen, never planned to hurt me again after the damage caused by our breakup. The thing with Maddie had started innocently enough, just two people who understood the guilt of hurting someone they both cared about. But feelings had developed faster than either of them expected, and by the time they realized how serious things had gotten, Maddie was already pregnant. I let him talk, watching his profile as he stared at the water, and explained how the past few months had unfolded. He'd been miserable after our breakup, he admitted, realizing too late that his fears about commitment were really fears about being good enough, about measuring up to my ambitions and dreams. Working construction while I climbed the corporate ladder had made him feel inadequate, like he was holding me back from the life he really wanted. Breaking up had seemed like the noble thing to do, setting me free to find someone more suited to my aspirations. The revelation that his insecurity had driven our breakup hit me harder than I expected. All those months I'd spent analyzing my own behavior, wondering if I'd been too pushy or demanding, and it turned out his issues had nothing to do with anything I'd actually done. He'd made assumptions about what I wanted without ever having an honest conversation about our concerns, and that cowardice had cost us our relationship. Now apparently Maddie had convinced him he was good enough, had built him up in ways I'd never known he needed. When he finally looked at me directly, his green eyes were filled with something that looked like genuine remorse. He understood that asking me to be okay with this situation was unfair, he said. He knew the maid of honor request was asking too much, that my presence at the wedding might be more than anyone could reasonably expect. But Maddie was convinced our sisterly relationship could weather this storm, and she was desperate to maintain family unity, especially with a baby coming. The mention of the baby made my throat tight. In all my processing of this situation, I'd been focused on the betrayal and the pain, not on the innocent life that would be born from this complicated mess. Tyler's hand moved unconsciously to his pocket, where I could see the outline of what was probably an ultrasound photo. He was going to be a father, was already thinking of himself in that role, and the transformation in him was visible even in this brief interaction. The man who'd claimed he wasn't ready for commitment had found his purpose in impending parenthood. I asked him the question that had been burning in my mind since Maddie's revelation: did he love her, really love her, or was this just about doing the right thing because of the pregnancy? He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he considered his answer. Then he admitted something that hurt worse than any other revelation so far. He did love Maddie, genuinely and deeply, in a way that was different from what we'd had. With her he felt lighter somehow, less pressured to be someone he wasn't. She accepted him exactly as he was, blue-collar job and all, without any unspoken expectations about who he should become. The implication stung viciously because it suggested I'd been the problem in our relationship, that my ambitions and goals had somehow made him feel inadequate when that had never been my intention. But hearing him talk about Maddie with such obvious affection made one thing crystal clear. This wasn't just about the pregnancy or doing the right thing. He'd genuinely fallen for my sister, and they were building something real together, something that had nothing to do with me except for the painful fact that it had started while I was still healing from our breakup. We talked for another hour, the conversation meandering through memories and explanations and half-formed apologies that couldn't change anything but at least provided some clarity. Tyler admitted they'd been terrified to tell me, had put off the revelation for weeks while Maddie's pregnancy progressed. They'd hoped there might be a gentle way to break the news, some approach that would minimize my pain, but ultimately realized there was no good way to tell someone that your ex and your sister were having a baby together. When I finally stood to leave, Tyler stood too, and for an awkward moment we both hesitated before he pulled me into a brief hug. It felt strange and familiar and completely wrong all at once. He whispered one more apology, then watched as I walked back to my car without looking back. The drive home was mechanical, my mind spinning with everything we'd discussed. The conversation hadn't provided the closure I'd hoped for, but it had given me information I needed to make a decision about Maddie's request. That evening I sat in my apartment with my laptop open to a blank document, trying to work on a marketing proposal that was due on Monday, but my mind kept wandering back to the wedding question, to the impossible position I'd been put in. My phone buzzed with another text from Maddie, this one with photos of potential wedding venues. She was looking at places in Portland with river views, small intimate spaces that could hold 50 people max. Her excitement was palpable even through text messages, and part of me recognized that this was supposed to be a happy time for her regardless of how it affected me. Becca called later that night to check in, and I found myself telling her about the conversation with Tyler. She listened carefully, then asked a question that cut right to the heart of the matter. What did I actually want, she said, putting aside what anyone else expected or needed from me. If I could wave a magic wand and create any outcome, what would it look like? The question stumped me because I'd been so focused on other people's feelings and expectations that I hadn't really examined my own desires. The truth, when I finally articulated it, was complicated. Part of me wanted to refuse everything, to draw a hard boundary and protect myself from further pain by staying far away from this wedding and this situation. But another part of me, the part that had loved Maddie since she was born, that had played big sister and protector for over 2 decades, couldn't imagine missing one of the most important days of her life. The conflict between self-preservation and family loyalty was tearing me apart. Sleep was impossible that night, my mind running through scenario after scenario. I thought about my promotion at work, how the additional responsibilities would require my full focus and attention. Could I really take on a senior coordinator role while simultaneously dealing with the emotional fallout of being my sister's maid of honor at her wedding to my ex? The two demands felt incompatible, like I'd have to choose between my professional dreams and my family obligations. Around 3 in the morning, I pulled out the 5-year plan notebook I'd been keeping since my breakup. The pages were filled with goals and timelines, steps toward building the life I wanted for myself. Get promoted, save money, maybe start dating again when I felt ready, eventually launch my own marketing consultancy. The plan was clear and achievable, a roadmap to a future I'd created entirely on my own terms. But nowhere in those carefully written pages was there space for the chaos that Maddie and Tyler had introduced into my world. I thought about my photography class, how distracted and unfocused I'd been during the last session. That hobby had been part of my healing process, a creative outlet that had nothing to do with work or relationships or family drama. If I agreed to be Maddie's maid of honor, how much of my own life would I have to sacrifice to wedding planning and dress fittings and bachelorette parties? How much emotional energy would be consumed by pretending to be happy while my heart was breaking? The sunrise found me still awake, staring at my laptop screen where the marketing proposal remained mostly blank. I'd accomplished nothing productive in over 12 hours, my usual efficiency and focus completely demolished by the impossible decision hanging over me. Jennifer's words about the promotion echoed in my mind, her concern about whether I could handle increased responsibility right now. Maybe she'd been right to worry, because in this moment I felt barely capable of handling my current workload, let alone taking on more. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom asking if I wanted to come to Sunday dinner at the house. Maddie would be there, the message said, and it might be good for us to talk as a family about how to move forward. The invitation felt less like a request and more like a summons, Mom's way of trying to force some kind of resolution to the tension that had been building since Tuesday night. I knew I couldn't avoid my family forever, but the thought of sitting around the dinner table with Maddie making small talk while the wedding question hung in the air felt unbearable. Becca had suggested that maybe I needed to prioritize myself for once, to make the decision that felt right for my own well-being rather than worrying about everyone else's feelings. But what if what felt right for me meant creating a permanent rift in my family? What if protecting myself meant missing the birth of my niece or nephew, missing birthday parties and holidays, watching from the outside as Tyler became a permanent fixture in my family's life? The cost of self-preservation suddenly seemed impossibly high. I finally responded to Mom's text, agreeing to come to dinner but asking if we could maybe keep things light and not focus too much on wedding planning. Her reply was immediate and warm, promising that we'd just have a nice family meal and take things one step at a time. But I knew better than to trust that promise, because the wedding was the elephant in every room now, impossible to ignore no matter how hard we all tried to pretend things were normal. Getting dressed for dinner felt like preparing for battle, choosing my outfit carefully to project confidence I didn't feel. I settled on jeans and a casual sweater, nothing too formal or too sloppy, aiming for a middle ground that wouldn't suggest anything about my emotional state. The drive to Beaverton felt longer than usual, every mile bringing me closer to a conversation I wasn't ready to have. When I pulled up to the house, I sat in my car for a full 5 minutes, gathering courage to walk through that familiar front door. Walking through the front door of my childhood home felt different this time, weighted with a tension that made the familiar surroundings feel almost hostile. The smell of Mom's pot roast filled the house, a comfort food she always made when trying to smooth over family difficulties. Dad was in the living room pretending to watch a basketball game, but I could see his attention wasn't really on the television. Maddie was helping Mom set the table, and when she saw me, her face lit up with hopeful relief that made my stomach clench. Dinner was an exercise in forced normalcy, everyone carefully avoiding the obvious topic while making awkward small talk about work and weather. Dad asked about my marketing projects, and I gave vague responses about campaigns and client meetings while pushing pot roast around my plate. Mom mentioned that the garden was coming along nicely this year, the tulips blooming earlier than expected. Maddie talked about her boutique job, how they were getting summer inventory and she'd gotten a small raise. Every mundane topic felt like we were all dancing around a landmine, terrified of taking the wrong step. Finally, over dessert, Mom gently brought up what we'd all been thinking about. She understood this was a difficult situation for everyone, she said carefully, but family was family and we needed to figure out how to move forward together. Maddie's wedding was happening whether I participated or not, and Mom hoped I'd find it in my heart to support my sister during this important time. The way she phrased it made refusing sounds selfish and petty, like I'd be the villain if I chose to protect my own feelings. Maddie jumped in then, her voice eager and pleading. She'd been thinking about the wedding constantly, she said, and she wanted to explain why having me as maid of honor meant so much to her. We'd always been there for each other through everything, and this was the biggest moment of her life. She couldn't imagine walking down the aisle without knowing I was standing beside her, supporting her the way I always had. Plus, she added with a tentative smile, there would be some financial aspects where she'd really need my help. The mention of financial help made my head snap up from my untouched apple pie. Maddie explained, somewhat sheepishly, that wedding costs were adding up faster than she'd anticipated. Even with a small ceremony, there were expenses for the venue, catering, flowers, photography, and of course the dresses. Tyler was contributing what he could from his construction salary, but with a baby on the way, they needed to save money for medical bills and nursery furniture and all the expenses that came with parenthood. She'd been hoping, Maddie continued while avoiding eye contact, that maybe I could help cover some of the bridesmaid expenses and possibly chip in for a few other wedding costs. Nothing major, she assured me quickly, just maybe $2,000 or $3,000 total. After all, I had a good job with steady income, no dependents, and I'd always been better with money than she was. It would mean so much to her and Tyler if I could help make their special day everything they'd dreamed about. The audacity of the request left me momentarily speechless. She wanted me to not only stand beside her as she married my ex-boyfriend, but also pay for the privilege of watching my heart break in real time. I felt Dad shift uncomfortably in his chair, clearly as shocked as I was by this development. Mom looked torn between supporting her daughter's wedding dreams and recognizing how unreasonable this ask was becoming. I found my voice finally, asking exactly what expenses she expected me to cover. Maddie pulled out her phone and showed me a list she'd apparently been compiling, detailing various wedding costs with little stars next to the ones she hoped I'd contribute to. The bridesmaid dress was $400 for the designer option she wanted. Hair and makeup for the wedding party would be another $200 per person. She was hoping I could cover the cost of the bridal shower, which she estimated at around $1,000 for venue rental, decorations, food, and games. Then there was the bachelorette party, which she'd been dreaming about having in Seattle for a long weekend, probably another $1,000 or more. Beyond the traditional maid of honor expenses, she added almost casually, she was hoping I might contribute to the wedding photographer since Tyler's cousin who'd offered to do it for cheap had backed out. A decent photographer was running them about $2,000, and if I could cover half of that, it would really help their budget. Oh, and the florist was more expensive than they'd anticipated, another few $100s that she'd love help with if I was willing. My mind was racing, calculating the total she was asking for. We were easily looking at $5,000 or more, a massive chunk of my carefully saved money. I'd been building up my savings since the breakup, putting aside funds each month toward my goal of eventually starting my own marketing consultancy. The account had grown to almost $15,000, money that represented my future independence and professional dreams. Now Maddie was asking me to hand over a third of it to fund her wedding to the man who'd broken my heart. The silence at the table stretched out uncomfortably as I processed this information. Dad cleared his throat and suggested that maybe Maddie and Tyler should consider a simpler wedding if costs were becoming prohibitive. Mom shot him a look that could have melted steel, clearly not wanting anyone to diminish Maddie's wedding dreams. Maddie's eyes had started to fill with tears, the manipulation tactic she'd used successfully since childhood whenever she wanted something and faced potential rejection. I thought about all the money I'd already spent on Maddie over the years, the countless times I'd covered her rent when she'd come up short, the designer handbags I'd bought her for birthdays because she'd begged for them, the weekend trips I'd paid for because she couldn't afford her share but desperately wanted to go. She'd never paid me back for any of it, always promising she would when her financial situation improved, but somehow never following through. The pattern of me supporting her financially while she made impulsive decisions was well established, and apparently she saw no reason why it shouldn't continue. But this felt different, more calculated and cruel than her previous requests for money. This wasn't about helping my sister pay rent or buy groceries, this was about funding a celebration of her relationship with my ex-boyfriend, about literally paying to watch them commit their lives to each other. The emotional cost was already going to be astronomical, and now she wanted me to bear a significant financial burden as well. Maddie continued talking, explaining how tight money was going to be for them over the next year. Tyler's construction company was doing okay, but the work was seasonal and not always reliable. She'd have to quit her boutique job eventually, due to the pregnancy, probably around her 7th or 8th month when standing all day became too difficult. They were trying to save for a security deposit on a bigger apartment, since Tyler's current one-bedroom wouldn't work with a baby. Medical bills were already piling up from prenatal appointments and would only increase when the baby arrived. The picture she was painting was of a young couple struggling financially, and I could see Mom's expression softening with maternal concern. Dad still looked skeptical, his practical nature clearly questioning why they'd chosen to get married and start a family if money was so tight. But Maddie had always been able to tug at heartstrings with her vulnerability, making people want to help her even when common sense suggested she needed to figure things out herself. She assured me this would be a loan, not a gift, that she and Tyler would pay me back once they got more financially stable. But I knew better than to believe that promise based on years of experience. Every previous loan had become a gift by default when repayment never materialized. I'd written off thousands of dollars over the years, telling myself that family was more important than money, that supporting my little sister was worth the financial sacrifice. Mom chimed in then, her voice gentle but persuasive. She understood this was asking a lot, she said, but family helped family in times of need. Maddie's wedding was a once-in-a-lifetime event, and wouldn't it be wonderful if we could all come together to make it special for her? Besides, Mom added, I'd been doing so well at work and clearly managing my money responsibly, surely I could spare a few thousand to help my sister during such an important time in her life. The guilt trip was masterful, appealing to both my sense of family duty and my role as the financially successful older sister. But something in me was rebelling against the familiar pattern, resisting the automatic urge to say yes and figure out the details later. I'd been working so hard to build my own future, putting in long hours at the marketing agency, and carefully managing my finances. The promotion to senior coordinator would come with a salary increase, but it hadn't happened yet and I was still living on my current income. I thought about my little apartment in downtown Portland, the rent that took a significant chunk of my monthly paycheck. I calculated my expenses mentally, the student loans I was still paying off from college, the car payment, insurance, groceries, utilities, and the cost of my photography classes. After covering necessities and putting money into savings, I had maybe $500 a month of truly discretionary income. What Maddie was asking for represented almost a year of that discretionary spending, a year of saying no to things I wanted in order to fund her wedding. Maddie was watching me hopefully, clearly expecting me to agree like I always did when she asked for financial help. But I found myself hesitating, really examining the request instead of automatically opening my wallet. The maid of honor role alone was going to cost me significant emotional energy and time. Adding substantial financial burden on top of that felt like too much, like I was being asked to sacrifice everything while she and Tyler got to build their happy future. Dad surprised me by speaking up, his voice measured but firm. He suggested that maybe Maddie and Tyler needed to scale back their wedding plans to match their actual budget rather than relying on others to fund their vision. A wedding didn't need expensive photographers and designer dresses to be meaningful, he pointed out. What mattered was the commitment they were making, not how much money they spent on one day. The practical wisdom in his words was obvious, but Maddie's face crumpled like she'd been personally attacked. She'd been dreaming of her wedding since she was a little girl, Maddie said through fresh tears. Every girl wanted their special day to be beautiful and memorable, and she didn't think it was unreasonable to want nice flowers and decent photos. Tyler was trying so hard to provide for them, working overtime and picking up extra shifts, but construction work didn't pay enough to cover everything. She'd thought her own sister would want to help make her dreams come true, especially since I'd been so successful in my career. The comparison between my success and their struggles felt pointed, like my professional achievements somehow created an obligation to subsidize their choices. I'd worked hard for my position at Bright Ideas Marketing, putting in years of effort and dedication to climb from an entry-level assistant role to junior coordinator with a promotion on the horizon. Tyler had dropped out of college after one semester and gone straight into construction work, which was perfectly respectable but also his choice. Maddie had bounced between part-time jobs, never committing to any career path or building marketable skills. Mom tried to mediate, suggesting we all take a step back and think about this calmly. Nobody was trying to pressure me, she said, though that's exactly what this whole conversation felt like. They just wanted me to understand the full picture and make an informed decision about how much support I could offer. If I couldn't contribute the full amount Maddie was hoping for, maybe there was a smaller amount I'd be comfortable with. Even $1,000 would help significantly with wedding expenses. I excused myself to the bathroom, needing a moment away from the expectant faces and emotional manipulation. Standing in front of the mirror in the small powder room where I'd gotten ready for prom and practiced makeup as a teenager, I barely recognized the stressed, exhausted woman looking back at me. Dark circles shadowed my eyes and new lines had appeared on my forehead from the constant tension of the past week. This situation was literally aging me, stealing my peace and joy, and replacing it with anxiety and obligation. My phone buzzed with a text from Becca, probably checking in to see how dinner was going. I sent her a brief message saying it was complicated and I'd call her later, then splashed cold water on my face and tried to compose myself before returning to the table. When I came back, the conversation had shifted slightly, with Mom and Maddie discussing potential compromises like having a smaller bridal party or choosing a less expensive venue, but when I sat back down, Maddie turned to me with renewed hope in her eyes. She'd been thinking, she said, and maybe we could work out a payment plan instead of me covering everything up front. If I could commit to contributing $500 a month for the next several months, that would give them the budget flexibility they needed while spreading out the cost for me. She made it sound so reasonable, so manageable, like she was doing me a favor by allowing me to pay in installments for the privilege of watching her marry my ex. The conversation continued for another hour, circling around the same points with increasing frustration on all sides. Dad maintained that they should downsize their plans. Mom tried to find middle ground. Maddie cried and pleaded, and I sat there feeling the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on me. By the time I finally left, claiming exhaustion and needing to prepare for work the next day, nothing had been decided, but the pressure to say yes had intensified significantly. Driving back to my apartment through Portland's quiet Sunday evening streets, I felt completely drained. The financial request had added a whole new dimension to an already impossible situation. It wasn't just about emotional support anymore, it was about literal investment in a wedding that represented everything I'd lost. The money itself wasn't even the biggest issue, though $5,000 was certainly significant. It was what the money represented, the expectation that I should actively contribute to my own heartbreak. I thought about my career goals, the consultancy I wanted to start someday that required capital and financial stability. I thought about the promotion at work, how the additional income could accelerate my savings plan and bring my dreams closer to reality. I thought about all the times I'd put Maddie's needs and wants ahead of my own, sacrificing my resources and time because that's what big sisters did. But at what point did supporting family become enabling their poor choices at my own expense? Becca called as soon as I got home, and I found myself venting about the financial request on top of everything else. She listened with growing incredulity, finally exploding when I finished explaining. $5,000, she repeated, her voice sharp with disbelief. They wanted me to pay $5,000 to watch my ex marry my sister. Had they completely lost their minds? Even suggesting such a thing showed a level of entitlement and lack of self-awareness that bordered on cruel. She asked if I'd said no, and I admitted I hadn't given a definitive answer, that I'd left things vague and uncertain. Becca's frustration was palpable through the phone. This wasn't even a difficult decision, she insisted. The answer should be an immediate and emphatic no. I'd already been asked to do something emotionally devastating, and now they wanted me to pay for the experience. It was absurd, and the fact that Mom was supporting Maddie's request instead of shutting it down showed some seriously skewed family dynamics. But saying no felt impossible when I thought about the fallout. Maddie would be hurt and angry, Mom would be disappointed, and I'd be painted as the selfish sister who refused to help during a time of need. The narrative would be that I was still hung up on Tyler, bitter about the breakup, too petty to move past old relationships and support my sister's happiness. Never mind that the relationship had only ended 10 months ago, or that they'd started seeing each other just 4 months after that. Never mind that they'd hidden their relationship for months while claiming to care about my feelings. I spent the rest of the evening staring at my bank account balance on my laptop, thinking about what $5,000 represented in terms of my goals and dreams. It was 3 months of rent, a safety cushion if I lost my job, seed money for the consultancy I wanted to start. It was security and possibility, and future potential, all of which I'd be handing over to fund a celebration that would haunt me for years. The financial sacrifice was enormous, but the emotional cost was incalculable. Around midnight, I pulled out my 5-year plan notebook again, and stared at the carefully written goals. Everything I'd mapped out assumed I'd have my savings intact and growing, that I'd be able to invest in my own future without massive unexpected drains on my resources. Giving Maddie $5,000 would set me back significantly, possibly delaying my consultancy plans by a year or more. Was that sacrifice worth maintaining family peace and fulfilling my role as supportive big sister? I thought about Tyler's admission that he loved Maddie, that she made him feel accepted in ways I apparently hadn't. The implication that I'd somehow been the problem in our relationship still stung. And now I was being asked to literally pay for their happiness, to contribute financially to a relationship that had formed from the ashes of my broken heart. The injustice of it burned in my chest, but so did the guilt of potentially letting my sister down during one of the most important times in her life. Sleep was elusive again that night, my mind churning through financial calculations and emotional equations that had no clear solutions. I kept coming back to the same impossible question: at what point was I allowed to prioritize my own well-being, my own dreams, my own future over my family's expectations and my sister's needs? Where was the line between being supportive and being a doormat, between family loyalty and self-preservation? By morning, I was no closer to an answer, but I knew one thing for certain. This decision about money was going to define not just my relationship with Maddie, but my sense of self and my ability to set boundaries that protected my own interests. Whatever I decided, there would be consequences I'd have to live with for years to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.